in a neighborhood to go after a couple of boats.
Yeah.
This is about regime change, which, by the way, I think is potentially.
He's admitting it. So the guy who was the head of the Council on Foreign Relations is saying this is about regime change. So you know how Trump is going to overthrow Venezuela so we could steal their oil? That's why they've been sanctioning Venezuela and giving $40 billion to Argentina. Argentina is supposed to be a great capitalist society, yet they need a bailout from the United States. Whereas Venezuela, Cuba, we've been sanctioning the hell out of them, and somehow their countries keep moving right along. So now Trump's going to have to overthrow Venezuela because Venezuela has more oil than Saudi Arabia. Just FYI. So now they've been bombing these fishing boats or boats, and they claim they're running drugs. Well, if they're really running drugs, what you're supposed to do is the Coast Guard is supposed to grab them and you put them on trial. That's what you do with drug runners. But what they've been doing is just bombing them. In fact, now they claim there was a submarine, and so they bombed a submarine, but 2 people survived. And it's funny, the 2 people that survived, they didn't arrest them and put them on trial. They just released them and sent them back to their home country. Isn't that weird? Here it is right here from the New York Times. The Trump administration has decided to repatriate. That means send the people back to their country. 2 survivors of a deadly U.S. strike on a suspected drug runners in the Caribbean Sea rather than prosecute or hold them in military detention. Why wouldn't you want to just send them to Guantanamo? Why wouldn't you want to hold them in military detention? Why would you let these drug runners go back to their country so they could do more drug running? Oh, I know, because it's not about drug running. It's about overthrowing and doing another regime change in a country that has natural resources we want to steal. And it's not just oil. There's lots of stuff that Venezuela has. And I'm sure if you look, they probably have cobalt. They probably have all kinds of stuff for batteries. They probably have lots of stuff. The Trump administration is repatriating 2 survivors. The men who survived were being returned to their home countries, Colombia and Ecuador, for detention and prosecution. That's what the president said. Mr. Trump posted a 29-second video showing the semi-submersible vessel that was traveling partially below the water being blown up. He said 2 other suspected drug smugglers, whom he called terrorists, had been killed in the attack. Well, if you wanted to kill them, why would you just release them back to their own country? Why wouldn't you bring them to the United States for prosecution? I know why. It was not immediately possible to confirm that either 11 had agreed to so they haven't agreed to prosecute the 2 men, but Trump and his United States already sent them back to their countries. So here it is. There it is. That's the submarine they say was carrying drugs, and then they bombed it. That's what they did. And then 2 people lived. So Trump unclassified that video. So Colombia had no immediate comment. An official in Ecuador said the government was confirming that one of its nationals was among the survivors. If that were the case, the official said he could be brought to Ecuador, but Trump had previously described people aboard suspected drug smuggling boats, which the United States has targeted in several deadly airstrikes. He called them unlawful combatants. He has claimed the authority, widely disputed by legal experts, to summarily kill such suspects in military strikes as if they were enemy soldiers in a war. Even if they're what he says, they're just drug runners, you don't get to bomb them. You have to arrest them and prove it. We're not at war with Venezuela. It was a sharp, well, we actually are. It's a war we're initiating. It's a war of aggression. It's more imperialism. It was a sharp break from the traditional handling of maritime smuggling, in which the Coast Guard would intercept boats, arrest the people if suspicions proved accurate. That's how you're supposed to handle this. But this isn't about drug running, because the drugs aren't coming from Venezuela. This is about Donald Trump getting rid of Maduro and installing a puppet like Juan Guaido. That's what this is about. The decision to transfer the 2 survivors, however, was in line with the Coast Guard's practice of repatriating or handing off to friendly countries people who were intercepted outside the United States as suspected traffickers. It also avoided the dilemma of what to do with the first people captured in what Mr. Trump has declared a formal armed conflict against drug cartels. Holding them as indefinite wartime detainees at the military prison in Guantanamo Bay could have opened the door to a court reviewing whether this really is a war as part of a habeas corpus lawsuit. So the last thing Trump wants to do is have a court look into all these murders he's committing of these people in boats in Venezuela and what that's actually about. They don't want that. They don't want to have a hearing in front of a judge. They don't want them to be able to present evidence. They don't want any of that. That's why they're bombing them. And then if anybody survives, they send them back to their own country. Prosecuting the men in the U.S. civilian court would have raised other problems. For one, it was not known if any courtroom admissible evidence was available to demonstrate that the survivors of the attack, so they didn't have any evidence. So there's no evidence that these people they're bombing are actually running drug. So if they brought that to court, they would be embarrassed. Also, avoiding legal and logistical headaches by sending the men home seemed to contradict the administration's stance that suspected drug smugglers pose such a severe danger that Mr. Trump can have the military summarily kill them. So if they're such a danger, wouldn't you want to kill them? The Trump administration has justified its attacks on drug smuggling suspects in the Caribbean as a formal armed conflict and as national defense, but without offering an explanation for how it can legitimately treat the crime of drug smuggling as if it were an armed attack or combat. The administration has stressed that about 100,000 Americans die from drug overdoses each year, but the surge in overdoses has been driven by fentanyl, which comes from Mexico, not South America. And that's according to the Drug Enforcement, that's according to the DEA and the Justice Department and the Congressional Research Service. So all these bodies inside the United States government working under Trump are completely contradicting what Trump is saying. That the drugs aren't coming from Venezuela. The drugs that are killing people in the United States are coming from Mexico. And who says that? His own DEA says that. The Justice Department says that. And the Congressional Research Service says that. Mr. Trump asserted in his post that intelligence had confirmed that the semi-submersible craft had been loaded up with, well, if you've confirmed it, why wouldn't you show us the evidence? It had been loaded up with fentanyl and other illegal narcotics, even though we know fentanyl is coming from Mexico, and that at least 25,000 Americans would die if I allowed this submarine to come ashore. He did not offer evidence for his assertion about what it was carrying or about the possible consequences if the vessel reached the United States. The two men were the only survivors of the military strike late Thursday on a so-called semi-submersible vessel that was traveling partially below water. 3 of the U.S. officials with knowledge of the operation said special operations aircraft had fired on the vessel in the southern Caribbean after U.S. intelligence analysts assessed it was carrying some kind of drugs. Were those the same U.S. intelligence analysts who said Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction? Yeah. Minutes after the strike, analysts watched. So they were floating the Pentagon. Okay, we got you. On Saturday, officials said the Pentagon transferred legal custody of the 2 detainees to the State Department. Blah, blah. The apparent blah, 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 blah. So Alex Tabarek says, bizarre and troubling that the United States kills at sea without a trial, but won't try to prosecute the survivors in open court. That's because that's not what this is about. That's not what this is about. So the people on these boats are terrorists who can be killed without any due process. But if they don't die in the initial strike, they just get released to go home without warning? Seriously? Oh. Yeah. Seriously. So you can summarily kill them, but if they don't get killed, you just let them go. Isn't that weird? That seems weird to me. Here's the weirdest part about this. MSNBC agree. Of course, the establishment agrees with what Trump is doing. That's why they had a No Kings rally, and nobody made a demand of anything. Like, hey, stop invading other countries, stop the war machine. Nothing. Because the Democrat billionaires and the Republican billionaires all agree they want to overthrow Venezuela. They're always for it. The New York Times is always for war and overthrowing governments like we did in Libya, in Iraq, in Syria, in Iran, Afghanistan, and now Venezuela. And here it is. This is Richard Haass. He was the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is where all the horrible, evil fuckery happens at the Council on Foreign Relations. They're the ones behind every regime change war we've done, everything. They're behind it. So here's what he had to say.
In a neighborhood to go after a couple of boats.
Yeah.
This is about regime change, which, by the way, I think is potentially.
He's admitting it. So the guy who was the head of the Council on Foreign Relations is saying this is about regime change. This isn't about this drug war. This is that's just as big as lie as when Kash Patel says that there was no Epstein files. Epstein wasn't working with it. It's just as big a lie as that. And of course, the shitlibs at MSNBC and the Council on Foreign Relations and the shitlibs in the Democratic Party and the warmongers and the Republic, they're all on board. So the stuff that Trump is doing that they should oppose, of course, they don't oppose him because they agree with it. They agree with funding Ukraine. They agree with funding the genocide in Gaza. They agree with bombing Yemen. They agree with bombing Iran. They also agree with overthrowing Venezuela. And here they are saying it on MSNBC, and nobody has a problem with it. Let's listen.
In a neighborhood to go after a couple of boats.
Yeah.
This is about regime change, which, by the way, I think is potentially a good thing, given how Maduro has run Venezuela into the ground, how he stole an election, and the rest.
So when we get involved in Latin America, it doesn't always turn.
So we get to decide if somebody else has a bad election, even though Trump says the 2020 election was rigged against him. Did that mean Venezuela could start bombing us because they thought that Joe Biden threw the election? Or do we have to figure it out in our own country? Why can't we let the people in Venezuela? So that's just another bullshit reason. Oh, he did a fake election. He did a rigged election in Venezuela. That's up for the Venezuelan people to figure out. That's not up for us.
Well, that's why I said in principle.
Yeah.
This is there's a complicated backstory.
Yeah.
So we've got to be really careful. It's one thing to oust a regime, and we could probably deal with Maduro, some version of how we dealt with Noriega in Panama. But it's something very different once you've ousted a regime to successfully midwife the emergence of an enduring, more positive regime. Lots of things have to happen politically, economically. A lot of signals have to be sent. A lot of preparations have to be made. I would argue it also ought not to be done unilaterally. We ought to try to find others in the hemisphere to work with us. So in principle, I think the people of Venezuela could be far better off under an alternative leadership.
Name one country that the United States has couped and overthrown their government where the people are better off. Name one country. Look what we did to Ukraine. We overthrew their democratically elected government, and then we got 1.5 million of their people killed in a proxy war with Russia that didn't have to happen. That's what we did to Ukraine. Look at Iraq. Look how well Iraq is doing. Look at what happened in Iran. We overthrew their government, and then they put in we put in a puppet, and then they have an authoritarian theocracy to replace it. Now the people in Iran, instead of living in a great democracy like they were, now they live in an authoritarian regime run theocracy because we overthrew their government so we could steal their oil. Look at the people in Libya, the most successful country in all of Africa. We overthrow Libya, and now it's run by terrorists with open slave markets. Name one country that's better off because we did what this guy's advocating and what Trump is trying to do. He doesn't care about the Venezuelan people. He cares about stealing their natural resources. That's what this has always been about. That's what it always will be about. And it's not just Trump. They've been trying to do it for 30 years, overthrow Maduro. Okay. That's that. Come see us in Australia. Second show's added in Melbourne, Sydney, and Brisbane. We'll see you in Burbank, California, the day after Thanksgiving. It's a Friday. And then Pottstown, Pennsylvania, December 6th. Plus, January 11th, we're going to be in Waikiki at the Blue Note. Tickets not available yet for them, but go to jimmydore.com for a link for all the other tickets.